This is the Listener's Lodge, a podcast rooted in Freemasonry. I'm your host, Mitch Denning. Welcome back to the Listener's Lodge. I have with me today Carrick Arnett, who is a healer, poet, playwright, and my Masonic brother. Thank you for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
So I met Carrick at a Scottish Rite reunion. Is that correct? Or no? We did that Zoom.
We met over study club, but then
Yes.
quickly started to go on different outings and things like that of an esoteric nature. And obviously now we're two birds of a feather, so to speak.
Yeah. Absolutely. So what we're going to talk about today is some Masonic, esoteric type things without divulging too much and violating our oaths. We're going to get into some deep topics, hopefully topics that you as the listener can follow and just enjoy. So I want to get into a little bit of alchemy as kind of your forte, as I know you to be. And a spiritual alchemist, you like to talk about the history of societies, ancient societies that have used different alchemical practices that derive from Egypt. And if you would kind of go into a little bit of the history of alchemy, where did it come from? What does the word mean?
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've always been fascinated by alchemy. Even as a little kid, I was constantly obsessed with wizards and things like that, not knowing that that's actually the alchemists, right? So alchemy comes from Egypt because Egypt actually was called Chem. It was the land of Chem. Chem is the word for black in Egyptian language. So, and actually, I believe in Greek language, but that's actually what Egypt is from. Egypt is Egyptia, which is Greek. So they call themselves Chem. So literally alchemy translates roughly as like all things Chem, right? Mm-hmm. And really the $1 million question at this point is not so much the idea of alchemy coming from Egypt as much as where did they get it from? Because what's interesting is that we have this great modern science called quantum physics. Mm-hmm. And that modern science is actually pretty much proving the basics of what alchemy has been saying for a long time. So I'm a big believer in the practical aspects of alchemy and that there may be more to the story, so to speak, when it comes to the ideas of actually truly growing gold and those kind of things. And we'll get into a little bit of that, right?
Right.
But at the end of the day, because of the fact that these quantum principles are now proving a lot of what the alchemists said. So I'll deep dive into that in a minute. But basically from alchemy, we now have what we know as modern chemistry, right? So the idea and breaking that down into the idea of just the periodic table of elements and how each element, works and that kind of thing. So basically, at one point in time, there was this mythical figure, so to speak, known as Hermes Trismegistus, mm-hmm. right? Or Hermes Thrice Great. And Hermes may have been a coded word. Again, this might be more of an Alexandrian Greek merger, mm-hmm. But that particular concept may have actually pointed to Thoth, who, according to the oral traditions of the Chemite, was actually the grandson of the antediluvian governor and that kind of thing. So we're talking like Atlantis, right?
Oh, yeah.
And there is a tradition within the Chemite tradition, again, the ancient Egyptian tradition, that Atlantis was a real place, and so therefore these priests and kind of the higher initiates, your aristocrats and that kind of thing that were aware of the fact that this major society was sinking, kind of had outposts, right? And Egypt was one of them. And as you know, I'm a big purveyor and have studied with the Maya. The Maya was another one, right? So they, interestingly enough, all have the same kind of ethos, right? A general idea and understanding of the cosmos. It's somewhat of a same calendar system, and seem to know some major things that we'll get into on the astronomical side. And so that fascinated me. And then that kind of brought me into a place. Now, as you know, my name is actually from the Knights Templar. My family has these, esoteric traditions that go back. And as I kind of studied genealogy, I really understood that even more. But to that point, it all derives from this sense of I think the more mystical side of things. The idea of unified, or what the Greeks would say, the cosmos. Right. So instead of the universe, the cosmos, the idea of harmony in the cosmos.
Fascinating. You hit a lot of things really quick.
Yeah, I did.
But you started that out with them trying to, the whole basis of alchemy the general population thinks that alchemy is, the transformation of base metals into gold. But it's not totally what they were trying to do. They were really trying to, perfect base metals into more pure forms, but there was a more spiritual aspect to it. And I want to talk about this spiritual aspect a little bit more.
Yeah.
But side note, before I forget, and then we'll talk more about that. So I recently watched a documentary on how the Egyptians built the pyramids. And Eric, our producer, actually sent me this documentary, and how the maker of this film portrayed them building this was more pouring concrete and not...
I've seen that documentary.
Yeah, yes, and not moving blocks everywhere. So is there an alchemical element to how they were making concrete? Or now they were melting granite. Maybe there's some kind of alchemical element to all that, but...
So remember that alchemy is a study of the elements, right?
Yes.
So and the manipulation of those elements.
Yes.
So if you had an advanced society that was able to channel, that their whole society was based on frequency and vibration, and not necessarily on matter as solid, right? Which is what the Egyptians and the Mayans and these different societies were saying, and what quantum physics is saying now. Then you might be able to manipulate things in a way that maybe we don't know how to do yet, right? And that's one aspect to it. There's another aspect, if you are familiar with, and this is kind of going down a rabbit hole for a second, but in Florida, there is a man who actually was a brother, Ed Leeds Scanlon. I'm going to totally butcher his name, right? But he created Coral Castle, which was using very intense blocks. He was 97 pounds. He was a little old Serbian guy. Absolutely was a brother and a Spartan. And they can't figure out how he did it. But he said he figured out how the Egyptians did what they did. I don't pretend to know exactly how the Egyptians did what they did. I don't think anyone knows. What I do know is that there are markers that say that civilization may have either forgotten most of what they knew at one point. My personal hypothesis on this, and again, we're kind of like setting the stage, so to speak, for why I believe alchemy is a little bit realer than we currently think it is. But my personal hypothesis is that this antediluvian society had outposts elsewhere. And when everything went down there, and to be clear, about 12, 13,000 years ago is what we're talking about, there may have been in a more advanced society. And if you want to look at things like Graham Hancock and those kind of authors, they kind of point to that idea, right? But basically, if there are outposts, those people went to those outposts, and then of course the civilization was gone. If you have an advanced civilization and you have people that are trying to learn, at some point the people that, like engineers that know how to run this stuff, they're going to go away. And if you don't have this oral tradition that kind of continues that understanding, the technology that they may have been using, and we can go into some of that, that may die off at some point because you no longer know how it runs. You just know it runs, right? So, for example, At one point in time, the Great Pyramid itself, which may be a lot older than we think, because ultimately we don't have anything other than the casing stones that are there, which is the meat, the core of it.
Yeah.
It was at one point in time made from 3 different types of material. There was a limestone on the outside that was completely white. Okay. There was a black granite, which I believe is still there, or maybe that was on the outside as well. And then there was a red granite core, which is kind of what we see now.
Yes.
Right. So those actually act as different aspects chemically, and specifically to almost an insulating wire. So the red granite was known as a firestone, which has radioactive properties. Okay, the black granite acted as a almost catalyst, and then that white limestone acted as an insulating wire. So the whole Great Pyramid could have been a giant machine.
I've heard that.
In stone, right? And
Yeah.
that's what all these engineers are looking at now and going, this is crazy, right? And then underneath of it, there's an aqueduct. So this whole idea of the Great Pyramid working as a machine. And interestingly enough, Nikola Tesla almost copied that exact thing when he was building Wardenclyffe Tower, and starting to try to like produce free energy, right? So yeah, they were way advanced comparatively to what we are now. Another example is actually, and I can't remember if it's Karnak, but there's a temple where you cannot, there's no torch marks anywhere. I keep hitting this mic, I apologize.
That's okay.
There are no torch marks anywhere, and yet there are these crazy complex hieroglyphs, and they don't know how they lit it up, right? Dendera. They don't know how they lit it up, but there seems to be light bulb hieroglyphs showing that they lit it up somehow, right? And up until recently in Baghdad, there were examples of electrical batteries that could be put in series, right? The Baghdad battery.
Yep.
One of the very first things that happened when we bombed Baghdad is they looted the Baghdad Museum. There are people on the ground that say that may have been done on purpose in order to erase history. But the point being is that there were these technologies that were around that we're just discovering again that they may have already known about.
Again, all fascinating stuff.
Right.
So getting back to alchemy and the spiritual aspect of it, and kind of going towards the Hermetic, Thoth, and then getting in the Greeks kind of coming into it and then making it their own with Mercury, and talk a little bit about that part of it. And so what came first is, here's a...
The first thing is we don't know, right?
Yeah.
Mercury and Hermes were messengers of the gods, which basically translates to that they were dictating higher like knowledge, essentially. Okay. Thoth in the Egyptian framework, who was also considered Hermes, right, was a scribe and gave them architecture, astronomy, right? Like all the basic important things for civilization.
Yeah.
That's what we do know. But what we can say is that there is evidence in the Hermetic tradition, especially, of a heavy understanding of the Kabbalah, a heavy understanding of higher worlds or maybe even dimensions, and basically this universal idea that there were certain laws that were basically at the heart of creation itself, right? And some of those laws being everything has a force field or an egg around it. You know, certain concepts that the Hermeticists were very specific about. As far as the Greek side of things go, that really goes to Alexander the Great and the fact that when he conquered parts of Egypt and kind of merged the Greek and Egyptian civilization, that there was a huge amount of knowledge that was, it's literally kind of pumped into a nexus. And that's where Alexandria and the Hermeticists and all that stuff kind of like lie in that Greek Egyptian understanding of things. Before Alexandria was a real city, that city was called Serapis. So again, you're building on the tops of these other civilizations and knowledge bases.
Yeah. Cool. So then let's go a step further into, so we got kind of a broad, what's going on, what we're talking about. So let's get into more of the meat of it. Like what does it all mean? Like, it's something they did. Why is it relevant even today?
Have you ever heard that song by Moby called "We're All Made of Stars"?
I don't think so.
Okay. So he brought into the cultural zeitgeist the idea of the interconnection of reality, because in reality, we're literally all made of stardust. That's what the alchemist said.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about the sun, we don't think about it on a daily basis, but we're talking about an actual star. And that star seems to be generating all matter around it. And that's also what the alchemists said. They said that suns or stars were creating seed forms. And these seed forms were basically emanating and imbibing into the different planets and things like that. But the planets and the star itself were interconnected, that it was actually one body. And so to understand alchemy, you must understand at the heart of it, it is a solar understanding of reality. Okay. Once you understand it's a solar understanding of reality, then you understand that all elements are literally in the sense of almost like a birth canal being birthed from the sun. So if everything is connected, because everything was one thing at one point in time, then all things have the ability to turn into anything else through the process of either raising its vibration to a different element or dropping its vibration to a different element. Does that make sense?
It does.
That's what alchemy already knew, and that's what quantum physics now understands.
So you have your base, like this is what everything is made out of.
Yes.
Like how gold is created in nature. The alchemists tried to recreate how gold was created in nature, just in a faster way.
Yes, they just accelerated the process that happens in nature. And that's the one thing that alchemists will say. They're not growing gold, right? What they're doing is they're accelerating matter until they get to the element of gold, and then they're stopping. But if you look at matter, the periodic table of elements, right? If you kind of go back to your science class, you've got your hydrogen, right? Which is where the sun, right? And then all the other elements come from that hydrogen, so to speak. And then basically at the end of the spectrum, you've got like plutonium, uranium, all of that. And that radiative matter, literally, right? Mm-hmm. That radiative matter is decaying back into gases that eventually turn into. So this whole cycle, or the serpent biting its own tail, mm-hmm. is something that the alchemists 100% understood.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like
including antimatter, which is very fascinating because that's a subject that we're just now kind of broaching in science.
Antimatter.
Yeah.
Just brief, what is that?
The idea that basically every piece of matter has an anti-element, right? Sort of a black and white checkered situation, so to speak. Yeah.
And that gets back to the Hermetic Principle of duality.
As above, so below in duality.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, you can look at one of the most famous alchemists, Isaac Newton, mm-hmm. right? Who wrote about 3.5 million pages on alchemy and only 1.2 million pages when it comes to any kind of science that we understand today. He was very fascinated by alchemy.
Yeah. Well, see, nobody knew that Isaac Newton.
That's a recent discovery, which is very fascinating.
Yeah. And I've heard or read somewhere, I forget where, is that after either, because he got some kind of sickness where he had like memory loss and stuff, but it didn't kill him. That's
that
not
is
what
the
killed
theory,
him.
is that the mercury he may have been playing around with may have poisoned him, right? And that's a common thing in alchemists as well.
Yeah. And like, I guess at some point after that, he kind of stopped doing a lot of alchemy, because there was a quote I've heard of him that he's saying, if I could just go back in there and touch the metal again or do something. I forget the exact quote, but I've heard that.
Well, what I do know is historically is that he became the hunter of alchemists, right? He became the head of the treasury for the king of England, and then he started hunting alchemists. Mm-hmm. But here's the thing, and this obviously we're side noting for a second, but if you were a hunter of alchemists and you were an alchemist yourself, if you found real alchemists, what a great way to be like, listen, I'm not going to turn you in, but like definitely give me your formula or I'm going to turn you in.
Yeah.
Right. It's the implications of the thing.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of Isaac Newton that's very interesting, right? He was very obsessed with the King Solomon's Temple. Mm-hmm. He was very obsessed with codes within the Bible, with codes itself. And alchemy really is a lot of code. That is what alchemy is, right? On the spiritual level, when we talked about that.
Yes.
Alchemy is the idea that mankind or man is able to perfect himself, that there isn't a mediary needed, or a mediator between you and God, which is a huge for the Catholic Church, right? The Roman Catholic Church and the Roman Empire in general.
I'll let you finish that thought, definitely. But I do want to, because our listeners will probably be thinking, well, does that mean that there's no need for Christ? Because
No, as a matter of fact, what alchemy said is that Christ is the white stone. He is the perfected state.
That's exactly where I wanted to go, because the Rosicrucians brought in a lot of alchemy, Hermeticism into there, and they no doubt believed in Christ.
100%. As a matter of fact, what the Rosicrucians have said, right, is, I mean, literally Rosy Cross, right?
Yes.
The rose is Christ.
Catholicism was a big part of religion back when this was happening, and Catholicism kind of condemned alchemy, so that them taking a stance that there was no need for them to go to a priest to forgive them for their sins was a big deal back then for them.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about that. Historically, Catholicism were the scribes and the learned up until about the 1600s, 1700s, somewhere in there. Really the 1600s. And there was a big push, and we'll get into that in a minute. But a lot of the alchemists were friars and priests that had picked up enough of, because they were the learned, right? They were the ones that could read the liturgy. They had picked up enough of what was going on in the Bible and had played around with these ideas of alchemy and with what is considered today to be Jewish mysticism, which isn't exactly accurate, the Kabbalah, which means oral tradition, by the way. And we'll get into that for a sec, because that's actually key. If you look at, and you know this because you're also a student of alchemy, I know this about you, and the Hermetics. And so the Tree of Life and the Kabbalah and the Sephiroth and all that are huge proponents of that code, right?
Yeah.
But technically, the Kabbalah may have come, and this is where it's interesting, because the oral tradition says, and the rabbis say, that the Kabbalah may have come from Chaldea, from Babylon, and that the Zoroastrian movement and the Magian movement and the Sabians may have brought Kabbalah, and that the Jewish people, you know, your Abrahams, Moses, and those kind of things, that those people may have been in captivity in Babylon, in captivity in Egypt, and basically through that process of being in captivity had learned that information. There is an interesting point to that, which is that Moses was a prince of Egypt, and all royalty of Egypt had to learn alchemy. So Moses may have become a high alchemist, as his, interestingly enough, his cousin Aaron, or brother Aaron, right? But brother is interesting because he may have been more like a cousin. We're not sure on that.
Yeah.
Like they definitely weren't related.
I think it's written somewhere. I can't quote the verse exactly. It's either in Acts or it's going through kind of how the story of how God helped the Jewish nation out of Egypt, and through
parting of the Red Sea, the manna for 40 days in the desert. Oh, it's good stuff.
Through Moses, and what I'm getting at is somewhere it says that he was either instructed or informed in all the mysteries of Egypt.
That's right. And so what you have to look at with the Bible and what these scribes knew, right, until present day in the 1600s, and again, we'll kind of cross that bridge in a minute, is that, all of this stuff seemed to come from Babylon and Egypt and, you know, from these traditions. And 100%, the Egyptians were right there, right? Like literally, if you look at the plagues and everything, you know, there's a battle between, you know, the wizards, the wise of Egypt, and they throw the staff down and it becomes a serpent, and, you know, Aaron throws the staff down and it becomes a serpent. So there's obviously some kind of science going on, right?
Sure.
That may have been allegorical, but it still points to the fact that they kind of both knew the same thing, right?
Yeah.
So that was up until that moment, right? And we'll get into the Roman Catholic Church a little bit more of a deep dive in a minute.
Fine. Yeah.
But there was a point where all of a sudden the masses, because of the printing press supposedly, became aware of the Bible en masse, right? And that was the whole Protestant Reformation. All of that happened after that. And the first time that the King James Bible was printed, the same printing press, almost the same month, printed the folios of Shakespeare.
Huh.
And there is evidence that Francis Bacon may have written both Shakespeare and may have had a hand in the King James Bible.
Interesting.
Why I say that is that there were folios that were put into the first printing of both the folios of Shakespeare and the King James Bible that had very strong Masonic, alchemical, and Rosicrucian marks that are very obvious to anyone who can recognize those symbols that were put into both editions, the first editions of these books.
So what came first, the Rosicrucians or the King James Bible? Or do we know?
The King James Bible came after the Rosicrucians.
Gotcha. Now, do we know, I have no idea, do we know the origins of the Rosicrucians, or is that just something that is clouded in history, that kind of like Masonry?
It's clouded in a allegory.
Got it.
That may have some truth to it.
Yeah.
But the origin of the Rosicrucian Society. Now, if you ask someone from the American version, which is the only version I know,
sure,
because of my family, actually, my great-great-grandmother was a high-level Rosicrucian. But if you ask someone in that realm, their tradition is, and this is very interesting, we can talk about this for a second because it goes back to Egypt, literally comes from Akhenaten.
Really?
Yes. So Akhenaten was the only Egyptian that completely, and there are people that will say, and I don't pretend to know, because Moses is a hard character currently, and who knows, the more we dig down, the more we find, right? But he's a hard character to pin down. So there are some people that believe that Moses was Akhenaten.
Fascinating.
Yeah. So the idea behind Akhenaten is, for the first time, the art, the hieroglyphs, everything were monotheistic. They were polytheistic. Akhenaten took rule and said, we're monotheistic.
But there was a pharaoh that...
And then they became polytheistic again.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, so there was a pharaoh, I think, right, that before Akhenaten that was polytheistic, that Akhenaten was kind of...
That's right.
Basing his views off of.
Yes. And for the life of me...
I can't remember.
Yeah, we can probably talk offline about that as far as the whole lineage, right?
Yeah, sure.
But the point is that according to the Rosicrucian societies, which are the ones in Pennsylvania, the one in, I think there are two. I don't think one of them is active anymore, but there used to be two in California, Amorc, and then there was one above Amorc that was more active in the 20s. But they all of them, right, say they got their charter from France and from Scotland.
To go back to the 16th, 17th century Rosicrucians, they
supposedly,
may not be the same.
The tradition comes from Akhenaten initially, right?
Gotcha.
And again, they actually, they all have traditions of an antediluvian society.
Yeah.
So the story, and I'll give you a very brief
it's fine.
run up on it, is Father CRC, Christian Rosenkreutz, okay?
Yes.
Or Rosencroy, depending on who you talk to or who you know, had traveled to essentially Persia, to Iran, to the area, Turkey, that kind of thing, to Morocco, which, interestingly enough, maybe where our fez comes from in the temple, but that's a different story altogether. And that there were ancient information and science that he learned from these different Arabian alchemists who took him in. And then he became proficient enough in that science. When he came back to Germany, which is where he was from, there were a group of, and I want to say it was 9, which is interesting because the Knights Templar was also 9. But there were 9 kind of masters that he had trained, and that they were supposed to basically like show up every year, or I think it's like maybe even 9 years or something like that. But there was a time frame that they would show up every, couple of years, or every 9 years or 20 years or whatever, and kind of reemerge with each other and discuss and, kind of like further the order.
Yeah.
But some of the principles behind it are the perfection of man, and the idea of the perfection of material matter itself, which is what the true alchemists would say that they're really up to. They're not trying to grow lead into gold. They're perfecting matter.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So, kind of to not necessarily like we're not done yet talking, but to kind of sum everything up into why are we talking about this today. All of this that we're talking about, deriving from Egypt and then getting into the Rosicrucians, is more or less setting up the world, or England, that
Well, Europe.
Europe.
I would say Europe, and maybe even a little bit of Prussia back when Prussia was a thing.
Yeah, but
the Ottoman Empire, so to speak.
Yeah, but what I'm getting into is the teachings and stuff from those things are in the Masonic Lodge as we know it today. A lot of those things you can find in our rituals, which I don't want to go into obviously too deep into those.
Well, I won't, right?
Right.
But what I will say is that you're not inaccurate.
Yeah.
That there is a public domain of knowledge, right? For example, the plum, one of the tools that we obviously use, and something I don't think is any Masonic secret, is made from lead. Okay. And the symbol that is a circle with a dot in it is the known symbol for both the sun and for gold. So it doesn't, it's not too far off to understand that within the fraternity as a whole, there is a plethora of alchemical symbols, right? The pelican plucking its breast is a direct symbol from the Rosicrucian Society. And as you know, within our own order, that symbol is also within our fraternity. But I don't know that there are people within our fraternity that are aware of the fact that the lineage is deeper than Masonic lineage, right? So, in my opinion, the Rosicrucian Society was a stream of society, so to speak, that was also a part of the Knights Templar Society, that was also a Masonic society, the Illuminati was, like all of that was connected as this different network, kind of octopus society that's all saying the same thing. And that's where we can kind of like dip our toe. Because they were all saying we don't need a mediator, that we can become one with God or one with creation.
We don't need a mediator here on earth.
We can become the mediator. We can basically attain that consciousness, and so therefore we can become like an antenna, like a lightning rod.
Like kind of like going biblical when Paul talks to the Church of Corinth saying, you now have the mind of Christ.
Or going biblical again when it red letter, when Jesus said, you are God. You know,
lively stones.
Exactly. It's definitely prevalent in these different societies. And it's powerful. And it was so powerful that these same alchemists in the form of the Knights Templar created the first banks, created the first, create a lot of the infrastructure that we still have in place today.
Well, Albert Pike himself in the Book of the Words says that who we have to thank as Masons for a lot of the things that are in our rituals is the Rosicrucians. And he blatantly says that. And back to your point where you said that a lot of people don't know that today. And I've had the thought before that a lot of Masons back in the 1800s and early 1800s knew a lot of this alchemical stuff. And I think so. But even Albert Pike said that there are many Masons who never looked deeper into the meanings of the symbols that you learn that are revealed to you in the rituals. But he goes in to say that revealed just means reveiling the more hidden meaning of it, which is the real meaning of the symbols that you're getting in a Masonic degree. Not saying that you're getting it wrong, but a lot of people get it as face value. It's like, oh, well, this is what I was told in the degree, and this is what it means. It stops there, which it doesn't, and it doesn't have to. Like what you were saying, there's a lot of alchemical symbols in the degrees without getting too specific.
Well, let's talk about that historically.
Yeah.
The founders of our current ritual were known members of the Kabbalah Society.
There you go.
All three. The Kabbalah Society were all interested in alchemy, mysticism, magic, Egypt, Babylon, etc. Right? The founders of our Degusile specifically, who was basically the engineer that made Newton's stuff work and was the showman for Newton, okay, helped the Royal Society. So science and the Enlightenment and illumination, all that stuff happened within the same kind of branch of the fraternity. So there was a lot of movers and shakers that were moving this concept forward. But to that point, the fact is that there are things within our own ritual, even in the first 3 degrees, that are blatantly wrong historically on purpose.
Yes.
As a way to say, look deeper.
Yes.
Right? There are codes, and if you are aware of those codes, like the one we just talked about with the plum, it becomes obvious. It's like, that's definitely there on purpose, right? Most Masons nowadays came into the tradition right after World War II because the president at the time said, I am a Mason. You need to be Masons. The problem is that and this is crazy because there was a huge spiritualist movement in general, a lot of mystics before World War II. After World War II, there was everybody that was left. So all those guys went to battle, and what they may have known died with them. And what was left was a bunch of guys that said, well, my uncle who passed, or whatever, my father, my grandfather, they were Masons, I want to join, or I was told to join. Or you had these young people that came out of World War II that literally wanted to join because they were told to join. But you were left with none of the deeper side of things. And we can get into that a little deeper because the thing is that even Albert Pike, and Mackey and these guys, they were hesitant to look at a more romantic, masonry. That our masonry may have, even though Pike says that, we owe a lot of the stuff to the Rosicrucians. They wouldn't blatantly say our ritual comes from a offshoot of the Rosicrucian material.
Right.
But historically, we're finding more and more that is the case.
Correct.
Now. And I think what's really exciting, to be honest, is that Masonry is just beginning. When you become aware of these greater levels of culture that all seem to be saying the same thing and reading from the same playbook, it gives you pause.
It's great. All fascinating. So, and to play off what you were saying about, Masonry today, and Eric and I were talking about this earlier, is that a lot of people are afraid of what they don't know. And we've talked a lot on this episode about a lot of things that could scare people. It's like, oh, well, they're talking about all these mystical things and a lot of these alchemical, hermetic philosophies, and it could be, for somebody who doesn't know anything, it could deter them away. And in no way should that be the case, because we're all looking to do what? Perfect the human being, to better ourselves. We're not looking to take over the world in any sense of the term. We're all looking to better each other. Iron sharpens iron, and do it in a way to where we're both learning and growing in a physical and a spiritual aspect at the same time.
That is really what alchemy is about. It's the understanding and the practice of going within yourself, purifying the parts of yourself that are not unified, and unifying your consciousness, your mind, your spirit, your body, your emotions, so that you work cleaner. In a way, more streamlined.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
And so there were steps, right? Distillation, tincture, all of that kind of thing. But it really comes down to this. Anyone that has boiled water has done alchemy.
Correct.
Okay? Because you have a solid state of matter. Then you accelerate the vibration of the particles.
Yep.
And those particles then evaporate. That evaporation turns into a gas. If you evaporate that gas long enough and you contain that gas, eventually that gas will spread far enough that it will create what's called plasma, which is what the sun basically is. So if you were in like a hovel or a cave and you were watching this process happening with these different elements, you would start to kind of jot down these notes of, that's odd. Okay, water is doing the same thing this is doing. Why is that happening? You had enough of that happening that you had these masters that would come through that would understand that. Now, interestingly enough, a term that is used in alchemy, but is definitely in the zeitgeist of the culture, is when the student is ready, the teacher will appear.
Yes.
So this concept is that you have a master alchemist. The alchemist that's in training will get to a certain level of consciousness and then they'll plateau. When that happens, the alchemist will understand that they need to do something within themselves in order to progress, because as above, so below, as within, so without. So to create these chemical changes, their consciousness has to be at a different level than it currently is. Otherwise, the experiment won't work, which sounds like a bunch of hocus pocus until you learn about the double slit experiment, which is an experiment that was done in quantum physics recently on the light wave, where the observer is watching a particle of light hitting this board. But when they weren't watching, the particle was now turning into a wave. And so it was wave particle. It wasn't a wave. It wasn't a particle. It was whatever was happening, depending on if you were observing or not. And the alchemists, they understood that and they wrote about it.
So the alchemists, what you're saying is, to kind of sum that up, is we're very close to their projects, what they were
they call it the
working
great work.
on. Yeah, the great work. They were
the Grand Arcanum.
They were so close to it that they put onto it where they were at spiritually.
Whatever your consciousness was what you're going to be able to obtain.
Right. So whatever you could, create or have the matter that you started with transform, derive directly from how you were spiritually, how your energy was going into it.
I would say your consciousness. Spirituality, it was spirit in general. Like spirit comes from spirare, which is breath. So spirit in and of itself is, we like spirit, soul. We talk about the core essence of someone as their spirit.
Yeah.
That's not how alchemists saw spirit.
Okay.
The alchemist saw spirit as matter.
Got it.
So within all matter is spirit.
Okay.
Or breath. Well, breath is a expanding and contracting.
Yes.
That is the principle of alchemy. But it is also, the alchemist was putting in a laboratory, in a test, in a vial, in a vessel, they were putting the universe in miniature. And so what the first tenets of alchemy, most alchemists were reading the all of Genesis, the beginning of creation, because the alchemist said that the Genesis was basically this recipe book for current alchemy. And by following it, its steps, the darkness, the light, the splitting, the whole thing, that they basically were going to be able to recreate matter, right? The other thing that's interesting is the alchemist talked about seeds, that there was a seed within the vegetable matter, that there was a seed within the metal, that there was a seed within man, and that those seeds were what the perfected state was, right? But if you think about a seed creates its own kind, reproduces, and it is infinite, abundant. And that was really the goal. Gold or other metals being purified and expanded and grown, so to speak, so that you had more of it than when you first started. That was really secondary to the process of going further within their own consciousness when they were able to obtain gold and reproduce it long term, so to speak. That they were able to understand greater spiritual lessons, greater universal lessons.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So all fascinating. just how close they were to their work. Now, I've heard that they had meditation rooms next to their labs where they would go in and get themselves right before they went in to do their work. And
yeah, absolutely.
And we as Masons, we as human beings should take that into account in anything that we do.
What you're doing is you're saying, I surrender my ego. I surrender the parts of me that don't know greater levels of awareness, right? Something greater than me, whatever your belief is, right? Mm-hmm. Whether it's Islamic or Christian or Judaic, it doesn't matter. There's something outside of yourself that's greater than you.
Yes.
Okay. The alchemists were obsessed with geometry. They were, because matter itself was geometric. And when you start looking with looking glasses and those kind of things like microscopes, right? They could see that. So they were jotting these things down. You have the rebus as a perfect example, and I go into that in a minute. But but they were jotting these things down because they recognized, Einstein actually studied alchemical manuscripts and formulas every night before he and was a brother before he produced his famous formula on relativity. So they were aware of the fact that there was something greater than themselves, and they were asking for almost like to come to enter the space in their consciousness so that they can understand more.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
It does.
And here's the interesting thing. There's a tradition within science that the benzene molecule, as an example, was dreamed into existence. And what that is there was an alchemist, a scientist, quote unquote alchemist, who was having a really hard time, that knew he was onto something, but he just couldn't figure it out. And I can't remember the scientist's name off the top, but he fell asleep and he had a dream, and the dream was a serpent biting its own tail. And he woke up and he understood the molecular structure of benzene. So a lot of times these formulas or understandings or things like that would show up out of the blue, out of nowhere. And I love Leonardo da Vinci, who I believe was a master alchemist. I love Leonardo da Vinci's take on the idea of this concept, which is the concept of sfumato, which he used both in his artistic kind of philosophy, if you will, which is a lot of like smoky, lines and things like that. But it was also a concept he used in life, which could be, I don't know.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Which I think is really interesting, because here's the thing. You get people that are really on a scientific bent, and I respect science. I absolutely do. And I think that you need hypothesis, and I think you need all the scientific method. I think you need all of it. Mm-hmm. But I'll get with someone like, alchemy's been disproven and this and that, and Isaac Newton, and I'm like, yeah, Isaac, and they're like, he wasn't an alchemist. They don't even know some of this stuff, right? Mm-hmm. But here's the thing: we only know what we know, and you don't know what you don't know.
Exactly.
So therefore, the mystic, we talked about mystic. Mystic just means mystery. Mm-hmm. So understanding that there's this great mystery. I'm part Native American and grew up with Native American ceremony. And we talk about the idea of the great mystery, which is actually deity. But we call him the great mystery or the great grandfather, right? Because truly, when you live from a place of mystery, when you live from a place of being grateful and in awe of creation, the world becomes bright.
Yes.
And there's a sense of interconnectedness and purpose to things. Mm-hmm. Where if you live in this kind of mechanical, world that a lot of us are kind of stuck in right now, kind of a density, mm-hmm. There's this sense of just a humdrum. Like, what's the purpose of it all, right? The great questions that were asked by the Greek philosophers, like, what is the purpose of life? What is the meaning of life, or whatever? Well, that's really what mystery is. That's what the mystics are all about, is that sense of interconnection. Yeah. I want to point to the fact that if you look at where the compasses are striking, you have this universal symbol of iron, mm-hmm. which is another symbol, especially during this time frame when this symbol was created, mm-hmm. of work. Okay. Or activity, because it's Mars, which is the planet of activity or work. So you have this circle, which is very feminine, mm-hmm. in a masculine counterpoint. Mm-hmm. And you have a feminine aspect in what's known as a masculine symbol, which is the square. right? The square is constrictive, okay? But the symbol that it's right next to is known as Jupiter, which is expansive.
Oh.
So you have this duality happening within these two principles. And the same thing here. You have the compasses, which are used to create circles or spheres in a three-dimensional realm. And you have that in a constrictive aspect. So there's within Rebus, there's this constant balancing act that's being shown to you nonstop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is what, drew me to this image and how it became.
I think if you ever get a tattoo, you'll end up getting the Rebus, right?
I could see that.
Yeah.
And what drew me to kind of brand this podcast with the Rebus, and I didn't know this, but multiple companies have used this image because it's in public domain. It's not. So I've used this image for their branding. I didn't know that until I started using it. But I think it's a perfect symbol of unifying those qualities within a person. And it symbolizes a lot of things. For one, the universe, which, a Masonic lodge is a representation of.
Well, it literally symbolizes the entire alchemical process. There is and you've heard me talk about this before, but I am so fascinated by it. Okay. There's a principle within alchemy. And it's actually in the Rebus. So I'm gonna bring it out real quick. It's known as the egg of consciousness.
Yes.
And the egg of consciousness is known as the Orphic egg. There's always a serpent, or dragon in this case, aspect to this Orphic egg. Okay.
Or salamander.
Yeah, sure.
I've heard it as salamander.
Yeah, no, it can be. It can also be a coiled serpent, usually in a spiral pattern. Yeah. Tightly packed. This tradition is the aura, or the energy field, or greater body around your physical form. And that's scientifically measurable.
Yes.
It's known as the electromagnetic field. And every piece of biology from your cell to your physical form has that. And the alchemists knew about it.
Is there any other thing other than, say, the Hermetic Principles, which did the alchemists already have those principles? I mean, they had to have, but they weren't necessarily Hermetic until, or called that.
Hermetic means secret, right? It means sealed. That's like hermetically sealed.
Gotcha.
Right?
Well,
so
what I'm kind of referring to is when Hermetic philosophy, per se, kind of got out there, would that be the Greeks doing? Did they do that? Or did what came first, alchemy or Hermeticism?
Alchemy came second. Hermeticism definitely came first.
Oh.
Hermeticism came from the tradition of Alexandria, which was a Greek/Egyptian tradition.
Gotcha.
But heralds to probably antediluvian, meaning pre-flood, times. The greatest part of this tradition is that there are 7 levels or steps or centers in the body that, by raising your consciousness and energy, gifts and abilities within mankind unlock. And at a certain level, by basically the body itself, which they called the alembic, which is a vessel, but the alembic is the body. So their body, but also the vessel they're looking at, because both of these things are happening simultaneously. Whatever processes are happening within the vial, those processes are also happening within them at the same time.
Gotcha. So all of this is relevant to us because, and that's why, it all shoots down to.
Because there are 2 different levels, right?
Yeah.
There's the perfection of man, and then there's the perfection of matter.
Yes.
And the alchemists always said that they were perfecting both.
At the same
Perfection
time.
of matter, yes. Perfection of matter was gold. Well, gold has always been known as a sun metal, not because it's shiny,
right?
because it actually, there has been experiments that show that the solar energy and gold correspond with one another. The alchemists said that there were these different energies and they corresponded to different levels of consciousness, and gold was the highest level of consciousness. Now, interestingly enough, if I dig up gold today, it will be in the exact same condition as long as it's pure, meaning 24 karat, right? It'll be in the exact same position that it was 1,000 years ago. It does not, at a molecular structure, at a subatomic level, deteriorate. It is 100% perfect. So it doesn't oxidize. It doesn't radiate. Well, that is the perfect metaphor or analogy for Christ.
Yeah.
The solar man.
The Son
of God.
of God.
The alchemists saw Christ as the white stone.
Yes.
Okay. The white stone was the process of perfection, perfecting material form. So it was what they called the stone of projection. So are you familiar with a concept called grafting?
No.
Okay. Grafting is a concept that was created through alchemy, through the alchemical process in biology, where you could take a tree, something living, right? And take a form. Let's say you had an apple tree. You could take another apple tree, cut off a branch, put it on the first apple tree.
Oh, I know exactly.
Merge this, marry them together, and all of a sudden you would have a separate apple tree.
Yes.
That would have processes of greater genetic viability from the first apple tree, or a pear tree on an apple tree. So you could actually have these different trees growing off of this apple tree, as an example.
Yeah.
Okay. That is what they saw Christ as. Christ was, or the white stone, was this process of perfection, perfecting you. Okay.
Christ is the perfection.
Christ is the gold. Now, alchemists didn't make lead into gold. What they did is they accelerated the process within nature so that gold was plentiful through a process of acceleration.
Okay. All of this stuff that we're talking about, would it be right to say that a lot of these concepts that derive from alchemy, Hermeticism, can give the basis, like we're talking about the Rosicrucians, give the basis of secret societies of all?
Yes, absolutely. And here's why. Because the Rosicrucians and the alchemists, they realized that their mind had power and that their mind could actually change physical form.
Free thinking.
Not just free thinking. Let me bring it back to modern science.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
When you have a thought,
Yes.
we now can measure there's physical electricity that's surrounding your skull anytime you think. And the electricity is higher if that thought is something that you've been thinking a lot of. Let me explain that. Electricity is matter. So when you're thinking,
We're creating matter.
you're creating physical form. And the alchemists knew that. Going back to Albert Pike.
There we go.
Albert Pike was a plagiarist at his heart.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah. But before you had to put footnotes in, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that he plagiarized tremendously was a known text in the French. I'd love to get a French version of it, honestly. But there are two different translations that are both great. One by Arthur Edward Waite, a brother, and one by another brother, Greer, who, I believe it's Greer, in a French translation as to who've done a modern version of it. But it's Transcendental Magic. Okay. Now let's talk about magic for a second.
All right.
Magic is the process of understanding that your will, or really the alchemists, for example, were asking for divine will to come within and shift them and change them. And that is what magic is the process of your will changing substance or reality. Okay. Well, if you read the first chapter, which is called The Initiate of Eliphas Levi, who was a brother, he says that the ancients knew the power of their mind. And one of the first principles that was used was the principle of lucid diaphanous, which he called the imagination, which vaguely translates as a focused ability. This is in Latin, lucid diaphanous, lucidus diaphanous, which translates vaguely to essentially the ability of the mind to focus with the power of visualization or the imagination, and that the imagination with focused intention created change.
So the law of attraction.
That's right.
So where does that come in? Like the law of attraction?
That's Hermeticism.
Hermeticism.
That's Hermeticism and alchemy in a nutshell.
Got it. So there's the secret.
There's the secret.
Ladies and gentlemen, don't read the book now.
It's a little bit different than that, right?
Yeah.
The law of attraction states what you think about, you bring about. That is what Jesus said. As a matter of fact, that's what Jesus said nonstop.
Yeah, I mean,
That's all that Jesus said.
He tells
Constantly.
He tells them to, when you pray and you ask for things, believe as if you have already received them.
That's right.
That is the law of attraction.
It's in a nutshell, right?
Yes.
Here's another story that I love from the Bible. It's very mystical. The seas are tumultuous. He steps on the sea, calms the sea down, right? Which we could use an analogy and talk about that from a metaphorical, but let's say that actually just happened.
Yeah.
Because he's an adept.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, and I believe it was Peter who came.
Yes.
Right? They're both walking on water.
Yeah.
Both of them.
At the same time.
Same time.
Yep.
Okay. Then Peter goes, wait a minute.
I'm walking on water.
Walking on water.
I'm scared.
Oh my God. The scientific mind, right? The process of, I know what water is, and so therefore I'm supposed to sink. All of that goes into his field, his consciousness. And he starts sinking.
And he starts to sink.
Okay. Then Jesus says to him, fear not, right? Be not afraid, trust.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden he's walking on water again. So his fear, his consciousness, his imagination or magic, his imagination, his image of creation, right, caused him to sink, even though he was still touching Jesus. So like I said, there are esoteric principles
Oh, yeah.
within some of this work.
I agree wholeheartedly.
So yes, it is the secret, right? It is the law of attraction. But what it really is what you feel.
Yes.
And what you think, when those are in alignment. Or another way of saying it is, when the heart and the head are aligned, the hand is in action. The heart, head, and hand, right? Or there's another principle, to know, to do, to dare, and to keep silent. And to dare means the will. The will is super important in this whole process. It goes back to the Garden of Eden. We had free will. We chose, right?
Yes.
We chose to eat of the apple.
Yeah.
We, right, as society.
Yeah.
So the will is in play. But what magic is, and this is what Albert Pike has said, that our fraternity is a fraternity from the Sabian or the Magians, which is magic.
Mm-hmm.
But what magic is using the imagination in order to create. Well, that's what we're all doing all the time.
Yeah.
Everything in your room was imagined by somebody at one point and then physically formed.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the process.
Yeah.
Now, there may be a formula
Sure.
that the alchemists practiced that would accelerate that process and they could bring things about faster.
Mm-hmm.
Part of that is that there was a belief in the power of the word, which, if you think about it, if everything is vibration, which we know is true, right? Like nothing is really solid.
Right.
This is all vibrating at a very fast rate of speed, but it appears solid. The only thing that you have that is also vibration is speech.
Yes.
So your speech, your thoughts affect physical matter.
Or your breath. I mean,
Sure.
goes hand in hand. I mean,
Well, to speak is to breathe.
yes. And when it says that after Adam ate of the fruit
Right.
and God walked
Yeah, among the garden.
Among the garden in the cool of the day.
Yeah.
It doesn't say God physically walked. It said his voice
That's right.
walked in the cool of the day.
That's right. Which is beautiful to think about, because that's literally like this vibration kind of moving through,
which goes back to the spirit of whatever. And it talks about in the New Testament how God is the spirit, and those who worship him in spirit and in truth.
So these Hermeticists and these alchemists were taking from a greater tradition, right? This greater tradition, I believe, is a more of a higher science, meaning knowledge, science and knowledge being the same thing, right? Like science being what we know, what we can experience and know. There was a higher anatomy, a higher understanding of universal law. And that's what they said, that there were these universal laws. And when you followed them, then these things would happen. I appreciate you coming on. It's been great, man. Podcast today. We might have raised more questions than we answered. I hope you got something out of it. Be sure to check out our YouTube page, subscribe to the YouTube page, The Listener's Lodge, and listen wherever you get your podcasts. Carrick, do you want to plug anything? No, there's nothing to plug. Stay tuned. I'll be producing other works at some point, and then I'll plug my works at that point. But it's been great. It's been an honor, and I really appreciate the time. Cool. Sounds good. And I would like to plug an event that we are going to be hosting in June 17th through the 19th at the Scottish Rite Temple in Nashville, and it's the International Knights of St. Andrew Gathering. It's something we've planned for the last 3 years, and we're really excited about it. If you want more information for that, please visit NashvilleKSA.com. Thank you for tuning in to the Listener's Lodge. We'll talk to you next time.